In this video, we're going to look at either the mammalian brain or a human brain. And remember, the human brain and mammalian brain are going to look quite similar because they're obviously quite closely related. So the human brain or the mammalian brain. Now, if in your class you would have looked at the human brain, it would have been a model, right? You wouldn't have, I'm guessing you wouldn't have had a live version of a human brain, like an actual deceased person wouldn't have given their brain to a school, or shouldn't have at least. But if you looked at the mammalian brain, it's possible that you actually had a proper example of the mammalian brain in class. And what you would have done is, when it comes to the mammalian brain, you would have dissected the brain, which means you would have cut it open. And remember, when it comes to dissections, you would have to have safety concerns, safety procedures. And those safety procedures would actually be quite important for you to know. Even if you've already done the experiment, it's important for your exam, right? So, for example, safe use of the scalpel, right? The scalpel, that would be pretty useful. And also make sure not to eat, or actually probably a better way of saying it is make sure to wash your hands afterwards, right? I think saying that you shouldn't be eating the brain is pretty straightforward. If you do have temptations to eat the brain, then there is something wrong with you. You should not be eating the brain, but you should wash your hands afterwards, right? So those would be safety concerns. Obviously, scalpel would be, you can cut yourself, right? That'd be quite obvious. Washing your hands, also obvious, because there might be something on the brain that you don't want to have in your mouth. So before you actually finish up, wash your hands properly. That would be safety concerns when it comes to a mammalian brain dissection. But we're also, what I'll do in this video is I'll focus on the human brain, but again, more a model. And all this is also provided to you by the dot point, because dot point says students will perform a first-hand investigation. That means you need to be looking at the model, or you need to be doing the dissection to examine appropriate mammalian brain and appropriate mammalian brain, or a model of a human brain. So you can see they're not asking you to actually look at a proper human brain, more a model as opposed to the brain itself. To gather information to distinguish, so you need to tell the difference. Distinguish means tell the difference between the cerebrum, cerebellum, and medulla oblongata. That's task number one, right? Tell the difference between these three structures. And also locate the regions involved in speech, sight, and sound perception. That's task number two. Right, so those two tasks is what we're going to cover. And I'll just quickly show the three different parts that we need to look at and distinguish between. That was the cerebrum, which is the top part here. This is the cerebrum. Then we've got the cerebellum, which is the bottom part here. And the medulla oblongata, or often also called the brainstem, and that's this part here. So these are the three parts, but we don't need to only locate, we also need to be able to tell the difference in terms of their function, right? So we're looking at structure and function, or location and function of these three parts. And we also need to talk about the parts responsible for speech, sight, and sound perception. Right, so let's get into it. So first, we've already covered the functions in a past video. If you watched the last video, we would have talked about the function of the cerebellum, the medulla, and the cerebrum. But we'll do it again, and we'll look at the location, because the two things I want you to be able to do after this video is, tell me the location, or tell yourself the location of these three different parts, the cerebellum, cerebrum, and the medulla, and also what their function is, because both those are important when it comes to our task, which is to be able to distinguish, right? Distinguish means tell the difference. Right, so location. The cerebrum is located in the top half. You can see that the vast majority of the top half is cerebrum. And remember, it's put into four lobes: occipital, temporal, parietal, and frontal. We'll talk about those in a second. The cerebellum is in the back. It's a tiny fold in the back. And again, this is how it looks like in terms of cerebellum. And then the location of the medulla oblongata, that's the brainstem. So that's the thing that connects the brain to the rest of the body. And that's right here. And so that's the location of the medulla oblongata. Now we need to talk about the function as well. And in the last video we talked about, for example, that the medulla oblongata is responsible for body temperature control and breathing rate. Right? So that's what the medulla oblongata does. So it makes sure that our body temperature is always at 37 degrees Celsius. And that's the hypothalamus, which is, I guess, part of the medulla oblongata. And breathing rates, and that makes sure that we have our 14 breaths a minute, or however many we have. Right, that's what the medulla does. And the cerebellum, what it does, it allows us to have good posture, good balance, and it helps coordinate muscle also muscle movement. So for example, posture would be sitting up straight and walking straight. Balance would be making sure you don't fall off when, like if you're walking, that you don't fall down. That's good balance. You have to balance yourself. And muscle coordination would be just the fact that you can actually walk, right? So when you're walking, you've got to coordinate your muscles. That's all of these tasks are part of the cerebellum. And the rest, so the other one, hearing, sight, thinking, speech, and logic, all of these would be part of the top half, which is the cerebrum, right? So again, I want you to know where these three different parts are and the functions. Now, in terms of the other part, we need to be able to actually also talk about where speech, sight, and sound perception is all visualized or is all interpreted in the brain. So we've got, for example, these 5-6 labels we have to look at. The first two we'll look at are the ones we've already covered in the last video, which is the auditory, so the hearing, and the visual, which is the sight cortex, right? So the auditory cortex, remember that was there for hearing, and that was responsible, that was done in the lower part of the brain, also known as the temporal lobe. So that would be sort of this area, which is the temporal lobe of the brain. So in the temporal lobe, we have the auditory cortex, and that's that point there. Then we need to be able to figure out where the actual visual part is, perception of the visual part, which is in the back of the brain, the back of the cerebrum, which is the occipital lobe. So remember, that would have been this part here. So that is where your visual cortex is at. And then we covered sight and sound, but it also says speech. Remember, speech actually consists of different parts. For example, I'm talking to you now, and I have to do a couple of things. First of all, I need to be able to think about what I'll say. I need to be able to comprehend language. So I need to be able to figure out what language is all about, how language works. And I also need to be able to move my muscles that work my lips, my tongue, and my face, right? So muscle movement, comprehension of language, and thinking. So when it comes to speech, it's actually 3 parts that we need to be able to label. And the first one we look at are our area for comprehension of language. So I'm going to have to move this one. I'm going to move it to over here. And I'm going to take the motor muscles and move that away. Alright, so the actual Wernicke's area, which is responsible for the actual comprehension of language. So that area tells us how language actually works and what letters and words mean. This is the comprehension part. And that can be found here. So kind of in between the temporal and the occipital lobe. So right in the middle between all 3 lobes. That's where we can find the Wernicke's area. And the Wernicke's area is required for comprehension. Then we also have the motor muscles. Again, these muscles were there to be able to move my lips, my face, and my tongue whilst I'm talking. And these can be found in top of the brain. So these can be found here. So all of these will be responsible for different parts of our brain, including lips, face, and tongue. So the motor muscle would be here in terms of the area responsible for the motor muscles. And then we've got the Broca's area as well. The Broca's area, that would be the actual area which is responsible for thinking, right? So we have to think about stuff that we're saying. Hopefully. I mean, in my case, sometimes I don't think about what I'm saying, but most of the time I do. Sometimes I just blurt out random stuff. But yeah, the Broca's area is responsible for the thinking part, and that is actually found in our frontal lobe, right here, right? So I'll quickly cover it again. Broca's area found in frontal lobe, motor muscles found here on top of the brain. We've got the visual cortex in the occipital lobe. We have the auditory cortex in the temporal lobe, and the Wernicke's area, which is there for comprehension, kind of between the occipital, parietal, and temporal lobe. And remember, speech, we had 3 parts. That was thinking, comprehension, and muscles. So that was the Wernicke's areas, the Broca's area, and the motor muscles. And then we had the visual cortex for sight in the occipital lobe, and the auditory cortex for hearing in the temporal lobe. And we talked about cerebellum, medulla, and cerebrum as well, in terms of what they're responsible for and where they can be found as well. So hopefully that was useful.